War often rewards boldness disguised as madness. Some of the greatest victories in military history have emerged not from strict adherence to doctrine but from one commander's refusal to think conventionally. Such was the case with General Aleksandr Gorbatov, a man many in the Soviet High Command once whispered was mad. Yet in the dark days of 1943, during the desperate fighting on the Eastern Front, his so-called mad retreat maneuver evolved into one of the most brilliant counterattacks of the entire war, a strike that shattered 3 German divisions and changed the tide in his sector. This is the story of how chaos, courage, and calculated risk turned defeat into destruction, and how a retreat became a triumph. The year was 1943, the pivotal midpoint of World War II. The Germans, though still formidable, were bleeding from the wound of Stalingrad. Their eastern armies were stretched thin but determined to regain initiative. Meanwhile, Soviet forces were exhausted from months of counter-offensives that had reclaimed hundreds of miles of lost territory. General Aleksandr Gorbatov commanded the 3rd Guards Rifle Corps, positioned along a vulnerable bend of the Oka River. His men, battered but disciplined, faced 3 German divisions, the 72nd Infantry, the 7th Panzer, and the 106th Infantry. Collectively, these enemy forces outnumbered Gorbatov nearly 2 to 1, and they held superior armor and air support. For weeks, the Germans probed the Soviet lines with reconnaissance attacks. Gorbatov's scouts reported increasing activity across the river, new pontoon bridges, radio traffic, and armored movements hidden in the forests. The German objective was clear: a pincer assault to crush the Soviet bridgehead and regain control of the Oka sector. By late February, Soviet intelligence estimated the German offensive would begin within days. Gorbatov's superiors ordered him to hold at all costs. But the general, with his gravel voice and unshakable calm, quietly replied, "If we hold here, we will be destroyed. If we bend, we may yet strike." The Soviet command doctrine at the time was rigid: never retreat without orders. Stalin's famous, "not one step back," directive still echoed across the front lines. Any withdrawal could be interpreted as cowardice, or even treason. Yet Gorbatov saw the field differently. He understood that the Germans expected a desperate stand. If he gave them that, they would crush him. His alternative was audacious, even suicidal, according to his staff. He proposed a backward retreat, a deliberate, organized withdrawal designed to lure the Germans deep into a false sense of victory. Once they overextended and thinned their flanks, Gorbatov would unleash his reserves in a lightning counterattack. To his subordinates, it sounded insane. "Comrade General," one colonel protested, "the men will think we are running away. The Germans will take our positions." Gorbatov reportedly smiled grimly, "Let them take what they can. When they are full, we will make them choke on it." Reluctantly, his division commanders agreed. Orders were issued to prepare fallback lines in secret, camouflaged along ridges 5 kilometers behind the current front. Supply depots were quietly moved. Communication lines were doubled. Even the wounded were evacuated under the cover of night. By all appearances, the Soviet front remained firm. But underneath, Gorbatov was preparing a trap. On March 5, 1943, at dawn, the German barrage began. Over 600 guns roared, pounding Soviet trenches for hours. Dive bombers screamed overhead, and tanks began to rumble across the frozen river. The 7th Panzer Division led the assault, smashing into Soviet forward positions. The initial defense collapsed exactly as Gorbatov had planned. German commanders radioed that the enemy is breaking. Encouraged, the German Corps commander, General von Bülow, ordered an immediate exploitation of the breach. As the Germans advanced, they found abandoned trenches, empty gun pits, and scattered bodies. It seemed the Soviets were in total flight. Their morale soared. Von Bülow himself declared, "The Bolsheviks are finished here." But what the Germans didn't know was that every step forward brought them deeper into Gorbatov's trap. The abandoned trenches were mined. The retreating Soviet artillery units had registered every possible crossing point for pre-sighted bombardment. And the forested hills behind the front concealed 2 full rifle divisions and a tank brigade waiting in silence. By nightfall, German spearheads had advanced almost 8 kilometers, far faster than expected. Supply convoys struggled to keep up on icy, cratered roads. Fuel was running low, yet orders from higher command urged them to push on and crush the retreating Soviets before they could regroup. They had no idea that Gorbatov's men had not broken, they were coiling. By the third day, the German advance had become chaotic. Columns were stretched along narrow forest tracks, with tanks, half-tracks, and infantry entangled in the mud. The weather turned against them. A thaw began, turning the snow into slush. That night, Gorbatov called his staff together in a dimly lit bunker. The men looked at the maps with a mix of awe and anxiety. The Germans were exactly where he wanted them, extended, disorganized, and blind. At dawn on March 8, Gorbatov gave the order, "All units, advance and strike." The Soviet counterattack began with thunder. Artillery batteries unleashed a coordinated barrage on German supply lines and rear echelons. Bridges were blown apart. Radio stations went silent. Then, out of the mist, Soviet T-34 tanks burst from the forests, their tracks churning through melting snow. Infantry followed, shouting battle cries, cutting through the disoriented German flanks. The Germans, who believed they were pursuing a beaten enemy, suddenly found themselves surrounded. The 7th Panzer Division tried to wheel around to form a defensive line, but their tanks bogged down in the mud. Soviet anti-tank teams swarmed them, firing from hidden positions. By midday, the German front had collapsed into confusion. Units fought desperately in isolation, trying to escape encirclement. The 106th Infantry Division, caught in the center, was annihilated almost to the last man. The 72nd Division, attacked from both sides, surrendered after 2 days of brutal close combat. Only fragments of the 7th Panzer Division managed to retreat across the river, leaving behind hundreds of vehicles and over 6,000 prisoners. When the smoke cleared, 3 German divisions had been effectively destroyed. Soviet reconnaissance reported hundreds of burned-out tanks and armored vehicles scattered across the fields. Gorbatov's mad retreat had transformed into a textbook case of elastic defense, years before the Red Army formally adopted the concept. His superiors, who had initially accused him of unauthorized withdrawal, were forced to acknowledge his success. The victory at the Oka Bend stabilized the entire front and allowed Soviet forces to prepare for the larger Kursk defensive operation months later. Gorbatov himself was summoned to Moscow. Stalin, known for his suspicion of independent commanders, reportedly listened in silence as the general explained his tactics. After a long pause, Stalin said simply, "You disobeyed, but you won. Continue to win." It was perhaps the highest compliment the Soviet leader ever gave him.